So I went to Arctic Bay in June of 1979, and I left Arctic Bay in the beginning of July 1981. So I was there for 2 full years, with a short period of about 10 days in February of 1981 where I came south. So I was there for 2 years solidly. Um, I don't want to give a sort of narrative of the time in Arctic Bay. That would be actually quite tedious, but um, see if I can pick up a few threads. One thing I do want to say, and most people aren't aware of this, is that I had actually a field assistant with me. Um, it was a woman called Mary Bigelow, who was from New England. Mary had been a friend of mine at when I was in college in Toronto, and she decided she would like to have 2 years adventure in the Arctic, and so she came along. Now, she wasn't my girlfriend. As the Inuit Sioux determined, she wasn't my sexual partner. She was just a friend. That was very puzzling. But it was actually great having her along. And so when I refer to we, it's Mary and I. But it was great having her because, of course, she made contact with and made friends with very different people than I made contacts with and I made friends with. And so it gave us a much broader kind of scope. And being a very different personality, she picked up on very different things from me. So it was really helpful having the two of us there. And in some ways, although I don't think it would be the case anymore, but in some ways, Mary learned to speak Inuit better than I did. But so she was definitely part of the whole process, and it was interesting having her with me. Um, just a few themes, though, from the time in Arctic Bay. It was, uh, I mean, the overall experience is absolutely life changing, as those kind of things are. But we have to think about a couple of things. One is that fairly early on, I was adopted by Elizabeth Alalou. Um, It was just funny. I was in the co-op one day, and Elizabeth came up to me in the co-op and said, from now on, you're my son, and I'm your mother. And so I went down to Elizabeth's house after that to see that I'd really understood what she said. And yes, from now on, you are my son, and I am your mother. People always sort of say to me, "Oh, that's great. That shows you're accepted and integrated within the community." Well, personally, I think that's nonsense. On reflection, I think the reason was there are two reasons. One is that I'm a single male, white guy, whose, shall we say, history of sexual predation on Inuit women, not my personal history of sexual predation, but history of sexual predation on Inuit women is very strong. And I think this was one way they thought they could control that because what happens, of course, is once I'm adopted, I acquired 4 sisters and a brother, 4 brothers-in-law and a sister-in-law. I acquired aunties and uncles and all kinds of people. But what that meant is that, of course, all of my sisters, and there's particularly my younger sister who was the same age as I am, and all of my sister-in-laws, of course, automatically off limits to me. So as far as the Inuit are concerned, that kind of solved that problem. The other interesting side to that, which I never really could quite write about, but which is actually the more interesting side of it, is that having become adopted, and then that puts a certain range of women off limits, it then sort of generates certain women who are, so to speak, available. And so within about 6 or 7 months, the men, particularly the older men, are saying to me, "You see so and so? She's a nice girl. You like so and so? I think you should go out with so and so. Why don't you go and date so and so? Why don't you? She's a very nice girl, and she can have children because she's already had one." And I thought, okay, it's interesting. I mean, from the kind of structural kinship point of view that I was so interested in, that having become adopted on one side, it then generates a possibility, so to speak, for marriage on the other. I never took up that option, but it was kind of interesting the way that worked out. The other thing, of course, that's a problem for single white male strangers in that context is, how do you relate to them? Where do they fit in the social system? Everybody else is related in some way or another. Where do they fit in? And one of the advantages to being adopted by Elizabeth is everybody automatically knew how they were related to me, and then they took time to teach me how I was related to everybody else. So I was then socially located. Now, that has some disadvantages in the sense that in those days, Inuit say that it's no longer the case, but I don't believe them. In those days, you could not look at or speak directly to an opposite sex in-law. Okay, so all the women who were came out as my opposite sex in-laws. So that meant that I couldn't speak to any of them, which meant I couldn't really interview any of them. This is where Mary came in, of course. It was quite handy because I couldn't. In fact, many of them I never ever spoke directly to, anyways. We'd go down to Elizabeth's house on Friday night. The whole family would gather at Elizabeth's house on Friday night to watch Dallas. Very important activity, to watch Dallas. I would interpret Dallas for them. Got into a little bit of trouble because they thought that I lived in a house that looked like South Fork, so I had to kind of prove to them that no, I didn't come from that kind of background. It was wonderful. I would interpret Dallas to them, and then we would sit around as a family and talk until 2 or 3 in the morning, and they would teach me basically everything I know. They would just talk to me, lecture me, teach me whatever I asked about. So it was a wonderful way of doing field work, and the whole family was there. But the way the household was structured is all the women sat in the living room facing the television, and all the men sat around the kitchen table with their backs to the women that they couldn't talk to. All right. Now, because I was a brother, I could speak to my sisters, but I couldn't speak to my sisters-in-law who were there. So that was one rather critical thing, and it certainly placed me very clearly within the community. So that was one thing. One of the other things that became very, very clear is, I'd said that in the research proposal, the kind of model I proposed was based on this notion around co-production, co-residence, and the history of co-production and co-residence. And it became very clear very quickly that Inuit were far more interested in names, far more interested in discussing names, where they came from, and the relationships that came as a function of names. I've written this elsewhere, but one of the mistakes I made when I was learning Inuktitut and when I was starting this research, okay, just have to back up a little bit. The research method that David Turner used, and which he didn't invent it, but he used, was instead of going to you and saying, who's your mother, who's your father, who's your sister, who's your uncle, what you do is you take a picture of a person and say, who is this person? What do you call this person? So without presuming what the relationship might be, you ask them what they actually call the person. And then the job is, out of all of that material, to try and discern and articulate what those terms might mean in Inuit terms without getting into kind of a genealogical framework, or necessarily getting into genealogical framework. So when I was starting to do that kind of work or research amongst the Inuit, I was asking the question, Kishu give you this person? What is this person to you? On the assumption that I was asking for the kinship term. And very quickly, and I think it was Kamenik who said it to me, very quickly I was corrected and said, no, you don't ask, what is this person to you? Don't ask Kishu give you. You ask Kina give you. Who is this person to you? So in fact, what you're actually asking is, what is your name relationship to this person, or how are you related through names? Although that won't necessarily be the answer, because there's other possible answers. So that very quickly came to the surface as being one of the key issues for understanding, or for what the Inuit perceived as being the core to their own social organization. And the model, the ideas that I was working with was, okay, well, we go with what the Inuit want, not with what I want, and see where this takes me. And so I became much more engaged and involved in finding out what all these name relationships were in Arctic Bay, um, and sort of trying to learn how they worked in that context. In the process, I also picked up all the information on the genealogical relationships because that's relevant, but it's not the core question that people wanted to know. And so people were quite willing and open to discuss the names that they had, where they got them from, and then out of that would flow, what their relationships with other people were. And that was clearly, as I said, the focus of their interest. That's what they wanted to talk about. That's what they wanted to tell me about. And so my thinking very quickly moved away from that co-residence, co-production model to thinking about, okay, so what are these names all about? What's going on here? And that's where that focus of collection came from. A couple of other themes. We'll come back to that later when we get back to the thesis, but a couple of other themes. One was I noticed on Sundays that Arctic Bay was dead. Like there was nobody around on Sundays. Nothing was happening. I mean, it was just, I couldn't believe this in a small town of 380 people. So one day I said to somebody, like, where is everybody? And they looked at me like I'm a complete idiot and said, well, they're at church, of course. Oh. Well, this was one of those interesting things because, everybody, well, not everybody, as it turned out, but everybody was at church. And a couple of things around that. One is one of the first lessons that David Turner had taught us was that you do whatever the people are doing, right? So if the people are going to church, well, then you go to church, I guess, right? If the people are going seal hunting, then you go seal hunting, whatever. But that was, of course, conflicting with the long anti-missionary teaching that I'd had in anthropology. I mean, missionaries within the discourse of anthropology in those days were akin to the devil. I mean, they had just disrupted and undermined and destroyed everything. And so you certainly wanted nothing to do with any of that. But I thought, okay, well, if everybody's in church, I'll show up to church and find out what's going on. So I started going to church. Now, a piece I left out in my earlier part of my story is that I was brought up an Anglican. I'm what we call a cradle Anglican. I'm baptized in the Anglican Church. As a kid, I went every Sunday to Sunday school. As a teenager, I was part of the youth group at our church. Even in Toronto, I was at Trinity College, which is the Anglican college in Toronto. I participated in that. So I'm brought up fully familiar with being an Anglican. And walking into the church in Arctic Bay, it was incredibly familiar to me because although it was all in Inuktitut, they were using the Book of Common Prayer, which I had been brought up on and had practically memorized. I had heard it so often, and I can probably still recite bits of it. So it was very familiar. The part that was unfamiliar was, first of all, there was no minister, and it was led by three catechists. And of course, in those wonderful irony of things, the three catechists are all related to me. Kamenik is my uncle. Mukpa was my brother-in-law, and Suyuk was my other brother-in-law. So I was related to the three of them anyways. So I started going to church, and I realized very quickly that there were a couple of advantages here. This was an incredibly good way to learn Inuktitut, because I already knew what the prayer said in English. Oh, admittedly, Elizabethan English, but I knew what the prayer said in English. And so I could see how the words were working and how the constructions were working in Inuktitut. And it's terrific practice to stand up there with, 200 other people and recite out loud words in Inuktitut that even if you're not familiar with them, you start getting your tongue around them and get the rhythm and learn to speak them. And I, in fact, learned to read, not write, but I learned to read syllabics from the hymn book. If you got everybody standing there, and you got the hymn book open in front of you, and everybody's going, Jizu zi maki si makpok, and you can follow it along in the syllabics. It's very easy to learn it actually, and in a short period of time you can pick it up. So for me it was terrific for learning Inuktitut, and for now of course it's a bit peculiar in terms of the Inuktitut that you learn, but it was one way to really begin to immerse myself in the language. And there was none of the other white people in town went to church, so it was just Inuit. That was still in the days where the women sat on the left-hand side and the men sat on the right-hand side, which is great because all the kids sat with the women, so it was fairly quiet and peaceful on the men's side, with like a heaving mound of people on the women's side. But it was a very good way to learn Inuktitut, and so I just started going on a regular basis. That meant that when the fall came around, when the winter came around, that I was, unbeknownst to me, automatically assigned to the senior young people's Sunday school class on Sunday afternoons. So this is very strict in those. You went to church in the morning, you went to Sunday school in the afternoon, and then you went to church again in the evening. And so I was assigned to Kamenik's Sunday school class. So I had to go over to Kamenik's house every Sunday afternoon, and he would preach. One of my favorite memories is that one day he was teaching the lesson about the raising of Lazarus out of the grave. And the entire lecture was on the fact that Lazarus's body would have stunk. Because of course bodies don't rot in the Arctic, right? They don't smell in the Arctic like they would in the Middle East. And he was trying to explain to all these people that, the body would have actually been rotten and smelling. And to me, it still evokes an incredibly bizarre image of whenever I hear that passage of Kamenik telling this story. That relationship continued to develop, so they elected all the positions in the church in Arctic Bay at that time. So I was elected as a sidesman, so that meant that I had to count the number of people and take the collection every week. So that meant I had to go to church now because I had to take the collection and count the collection. And then about a year later, Suyuk comes into church one day, and Suyuk says, it's all in Inuktitut. Suyuk says, well, we're looking for a Kinauya Liri, treasurer. I didn't pay any attention. I wasn't interested in being a treasurer for a church, so I ignored it. Next week, Suyuk comes back and stands up and says, we're still looking for a Kinauya Liri. And it doesn't matter if you're Inuit or if you're white, you can still be a Kinauya Liri. I'm thinking, wait a minute, I'm the only white person here. Why would he say that? So I went down to my sister-in-law Ottawat's for tea afterwards, and Ottawat looks at me and says, well, have you been to see Suyuk yet? And I said, no. She said, oh, and left it at that. Later on, I went over to my sister Kumangapik's for tea, and Kumangapik said, well, have you been to see Suyuk yet? I said, no, I'm just on my way over to Suyuk. So I walked over to Suyuk's house, and there he is sitting at the kitchen table with all the books for the church laid out on the table, waiting for me to show up. So they had already decided that I was going to be the treasurer of the church. So I became the treasurer of the church as well. But just on that, I found out and realized fairly quickly that there had been no minister or missionary in Arctic Bay since 1946, I later found out, since Jack Turner died. Arctic Bay had always been served from Pond Inlet. And the missionaries in Pond Inlet would come over 2 or 3 times a year and do weddings, baptisms, whatever. And that was, in fact, still the case while I was there. So that, in fact, the Inuit had basically run the church in Arctic Bay since 1946. That's a long time for them to run it. What had happened is that the missionary in Pond Inlet had decided that it was time for him to move over to Arctic Bay because he did not think things were going the way he wanted them to go. The interesting thing about that is that they were building a house for the missionary in Arctic Bay, but there were orders in town that nobody was to work on the house. So it took over 3 years to build the house. Now, okay, if you know in the Arctic, usually they get these things up in a couple of months, right? 3 years to build the house. Um, we were just instructed that nobody was to work on building this house. They did not want the missionary to come over and interfere in what they were doing. To me, that was all really interesting. That was operating that way, and it began to raise the question for me. Okay, so how come? Why have these people taken hold of this thing with such enthusiasm? And they continue to run the show on their own years and years and years after the missionary has left. It became a real question. And what were they getting out of it? What's going on here? So that was another piece. A third theme I wanted to pick up on was the gender theme. Now this is where I had no background in this stuff. I mean, in anthropology in the early 70s and coming into it's through the 70s, feminist anthropology was just beginning to really hit its stride. But notions around gender and that there might be variability in understanding gender, just none of that existed. I had no background in that. And so I didn't, how do I put it? I didn't have the intellectual apparatus to understand what was going on in front of me. And it was one of those things where field work can be really interesting when you begin to run into something which cognitively you can't absorb and you don't know what to do with it. There are a few stories here. I don't know how we're doing for time, but in terms of the stories, my favorite one was so Mary and I had a house in Arctic Bay, the oldest, crappiest house in the housing stock, but it was still a house, right across from the co-op, right behind the community hall. So we were right in sort of the center of things. It was great, actually, great place. And this little girl, Gila, had decided to move in with us. Very Inuit. She decided she wanted to move in with us, so she moved in. And there's more to that. She was about 8 or 9 over those years. And so she lived with us. Anyways, Gila was quite like most kids of that age. You know, they leave all their stuff all over the floor, their toys and clothes spread out all over the place. She would never sort of help pick up the dishes or anything, or certainly never wash the dishes or like that. So she's a perfectly normal 8-year-old or 9-year-old. And one day her cousin Lily was over, and Lily was great. Lily picked up all the stuff off the floor. She put away the clothes. She put away the toys. She helped clean up the dishes on the table and do the dishes. Lily was about 11. So I decided to try that old trick on Gila, which most parents try on their kids. I said, Gila, look at your cousin Lily. Your cousin Lily's such a good girl. She's so helpful. Why can't you be a good girl like your cousin Lily? And Gila looks at me and says, Lily's not a girl, Lily's a boy. Now, this is all in Inuktitut, by the way. Gila didn't speak much English. And Lily looks at Gila and said, Gila, I haven't been a boy for 2 years. At which point I realized I'd lost the whole discussion had gone out of my control. But I thought, oh, wait a minute, what is going on here? Right? Well, what's this all about? And it was a perfectly serious discussion. On another occasion, in those days there was no running water in Arctic Bay. Only the school had running water. And so basically on a rotation once a week they would shower all the kids over at the school. So somehow, and I to this day don't know how I got volunteered to do this, I was volunteered to deal with the 10-year-old boys. Now, piece of advice, you never want to have to try and shower 15 to 20 10-year-old boys in the school. Anyway, so I got this gang of boys, got to get them showered, right? They all strip off their clothes, and 2 of them weren't boys. And I'm like, wait a minute, you two, you shouldn't be here. You should be next door, and with the girls next door. And all the kids looked at me and said, no, they're supposed to be here. That's fine. It's okay. And I figured, I'm not going to make a fight out of this if nobody else seems to care. But by my definition, you're not boys, right? But they said, no, they're supposed to be here. That's fine. That's good. They're boys. So let's go ahead. We go get showered. So, okay, fine. Go get showered. I am not going to deal with this. And I began to realize that, okay, there's something else going on here. So that was, another event. My third and my another one of my favorite stories was one of my closest friends was Arnaud Yumiuk. And Arnaud Yumiuk was a 55-year-old man. He had been married. His wife had just died. He had 6 kids, very competent, well-known hunter. Actually, he was the guy who taught me Inuit. Wonderful teacher as well. And we were out in camp one day, and Arnaud Yumiuk and I were sitting on the beach. Now, of course, this is in springtime, so when I'm saying beach, it's ice going out. It's not water, it's ice. And there were 3 canoes coming over the ice towards us. And the 3 young guys come into camp. They're in their mid to late 20s. Okay, so fairly young guys come in. And they jump off their skidoos and they go up to Arnaud Yumiuk and they start grabbing him between the legs and say, Atuk laka, let me touch them. And I'm like, and then all the sexual joking. I mean, I didn't even understand half of it, but I could tell what it was. Really, smutty, filthy sexual joking going on back and forth between Arnaud Yumiuk and these guys. And afterwards I said to Arnaud Yumiuk, like, what was that all about? Well, he said, oh, no, we're just having fun. Well, I discovered later that Arnaud Yumiuk had the name of the wife, of a woman. And these 3 guys had the name of her husband. Now, because of the difference in age, obviously they died at very different times. So these 3 guys, and the only way I can say it in English, these 3 guys were wifing Arnaud Yumiuk. They were expressing that relationship of being his, how do you put, you can't say it in English, being his husband, right? And I thought, okay, now it is of course totally inappropriate behavior to go up to an Inuit man and grab him between the legs, and you certainly don't do that to your wife. But this was trying to express a set of relationships, right? And so it became clear to me that there was something else that was really important that was going on here. That it was connected to the names. It involved an understanding of sexuality and gender that I didn't get. And they were literally acting it out. So, okay, as I said, I had no intellectual apparatus for understanding this. I had no terms for even, dealing with this kind of stuff. So what do you do with it? And, well, that becomes another whole story, so...